And that's pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional.
This literally is precept number one of the Buddhist doctrine, which is life is suffering or life is struggle. And it's born out of our propensity to become attached to ideas and particularly narratives and stories around who we are and what our value is. In a way, I find it very liberating, right? Because it basically says that no matter what path you take, there's struggle in front of you. So the logical conclusion is you should always take the right path. Being unhealthy is painful. Being healthy is painful. Having no relationships is painful. Having relationships is painful. Being lazy is painful. Working really hard is painful. It's just different flavors of pain. So you might as well pick the flavors of pain that are going to help you and give you a better set of life circumstances. This is why in Subtle Art I talk about how you don't eliminate problems. You simply upgrade problems into better problems, right? Like being obese and incredibly out of shape is a problem. Being in really good shape and having to work out all the time and being sore from working out and maybe having the occasional injury, that's also a problem. But it's a much better problem to have than being horribly obese and sitting on the couch all day and, having chronic diseases and shit when you're 40. So it's a question of choosing the pain that you want to sustain, choosing the problems that you want to have in your life. And what's powerful about that is that once you choose the problem you want, something kind of magical happens in your head, which is you no longer perceive yourself as a victim. You perceive yourself as like a challenger, a competitor. It's like somebody who's like facing the odds and is set to conquer them. And that's a really empowering mindset. In fact, I personally believe that is at the bedrock of where a happy and meaningful life is built, is choosing which problems you want to have in your life.
And you've talked a lot about too, and you've already touched on it a little bit about kind of the evolution, our evolutionary history of this. Humans are just wired to be dissatisfied, right? Like, believe it was Dostoevsky who said, if man ever finds utopia, first thing he's going to do is complain. And that's just wired into our DNA. And it's like you said, it's this negativity bias, it's a survival thing.
Can you imagine Twitter if people found utopia? Can you imagine what the tweets would be like? They'd be like, this is bullshit. I was promised 70 virgins. There's only 60 here.
What was it? Louis C.K. Everything's awesome. Nobody's happy. It's part of our nature. That is not going away. So like you're saying, you may as well choose that pain. You may as well choose whatever discomfort rather than just let it happen to you.
I think there's a really important distinction here as well between pain and suffering. Again, the Buddha has a really great allegory about this. He said that whenever you suffer, it's like getting struck by two arrows. The first arrow is the actual thing that hurts. The second arrow is the meaning that we create around the first arrow. Our skin gets pierced by an arrow and we start saying, well, why did I deserve to get hit? Why am I the one that's hurt? Why didn't he get struck by an arrow? He's an asshole. I'm a good person. Why does this always happen to me? Why? And then it's those narratives that we create around the pain that linger for years, right? It's like if you physically get cut, that's going to heal in a few days or a week or two. But the narratives you create around that cut, they can stay with you for your entire life. And so the first part is the pain, and pain always goes away. It's always temporary. But the suffering, depending on how much we buy into the narratives around our pain, we can continue to suffer for decades.
Right. And I think there's three ways I see it anyway about approaching this. Since pain is inevitable, like you said, it's going to happen no matter what you do. When the pain does arise, you can avoid it. Society, I think, is becoming a little bit more amenable to that as well. But there's also, you can indulge it as well and basically feel sorry for yourself.
It's the victim Olympics, right? It's like, my misfortune is worse than your misfortune, so give me the gold medal.
But then what you're saying here is you actively turn towards it and you actively choose it.
Yeah.
And that's where growth happens.
Yeah, I think you raise a really interesting point about modern society. And there's this sense that back in the good old days, quote unquote, you just had to grit your teeth and bear it. You had to fucking suffer through it and learn the hard way that the misfortunes in your life don't necessarily say anything about your value as a person. And 21st century society complicates that skill in two different ways. One is just the ease of comforts, the amount of luxury and comfort that we have. It's so easy to turn away, distract ourselves, tune out, load up TikTok, start scrolling. And then the second way is that there has emerged this subculture online that celebrates victimhood, that applauds people for, oh, you're so vulnerable, thank you for sharing. It kind of gets off on the moral outrage that comes with a very public form of victimhood. And I sympathize with why people do that. And I'm sure there's a certain amount of that is healthy. But I think when you generate a culture around it, it becomes very, very unhealthy. And I guess to put it another way, if there's a person who has experienced a lot of pain and trauma in their lives, I do think there's a lot of psychological power in them stepping up and publicly stating what they've experienced and how they've suffered from it. I think there's a lot of personal empowerment involved in that. And I think it's good to support that and encourage that. But there's a blurry line that happens somewhere where if you get enough people and enough encouragement and enough support, you start socially validating and handing out status to people based on victimhood. And you get kind of this victimhood Olympics effect. And that's unhealthy. And I think that's actually counterproductive because it starts to encourage people to invent suffering where there wasn't any before, right? It's like it starts encouraging people to sit down and think, well, what were all the horrible things that happened in my childhood? And how can I talk about that to people? And it creates an incentive for people to create the suffering-based narratives, to create the second arrow when it had been dislodged long ago in the first place. So, as they say, may you live in interesting times.
Which we certainly do.
By the way, last thought on this one. So this idea of the two arrows. The first arrow is like the actual pain. The second arrow is the narrative and the meaning around the pain. As children, we create a lot of those narratives and meaning, and they stick with us throughout our lives. And if we have shitty narratives, they hold us back. Dad wasn't around. Maybe mom was an alcoholic. We spun up a bunch of narratives as a kid to cope with that reality. But now we're in our 30s, we're married, we're having our own kids, and we're just a complete fuck up in our intimate relationships. And the thing that's holding us back now are those same narratives that saved us as children. I think project of therapy in many cases is, first of all, discovering those narratives that we've held on to for far too long. And then secondly, learning to unravel or rewrite them in a more healthy manner. So go to therapy, kids. Especially if mommy was an alcoholic.
Well, you do. This leads us right into the next one then, actually. Everything you believe will one day fail you. This is how you grow.
I love this because this is one of those things that it's so obvious. Like if you're doing science, right? It's just obvious and accepted that you're probably starting out at a place of ignorance or being wrong about something. Yet when it comes to like all these other areas of our life, we don't take that same attitude. If my next door neighbor does something that annoys me and I think he's an asshole, like I never stop and think, well, I'm probably wrong about that. What is a testable hypothesis that I can, repeat a few times and collect data on? Like we never do that. We're like, I know that guy is an asshole. And it's this like certitude that we hold on to that I think, again, these narratives that causes us to suffer so much. And I think it's such an obvious and practical reality that it is impossible to grow without being wrong about something. I think, if I can pull out my soapbox for a second, I think this is something that the self-help industry as a whole does not advertise enough. That, they say, hey, pay all this money, come to my weekend seminar, you're going to be a completely new person. What they don't tell you is, oh, by the way, to be a completely new person, you have to recognize all of the ways that you're wrong and all of the dumb things that you've been doing. And, you probably need to grieve an old identity or two, because it's not a fun process. The reality of taking a belief or an assumption that you've probably held on to for years, maybe decades, and then recognizing that you were fucking wrong about that, and that you base so much of your life on that incorrectly, like that is not a fun process, but it has to happen. It's very, very, very difficult to actually stop yourself in those moments and be like, wait a second, maybe my neighbor's not an asshole. Maybe I'm being really judgmental. Maybe I'm having a bad day. Maybe I didn't sleep enough last night. developing those mental habits is a really difficult process. Hey, everybody. Thank you for watching. This was part of the Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast anywhere podcasts are available. That's Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Stitcher, whatever you use. So check it out. Thanks for watching. Talk to you again soon.